Hey everybody, this is Mike. Welcome back to the Z Motorsports shop and channel. Today we are working on the old Jeep and we're going to see if we can improve the steering a bit and build in a little more reliability on it. So anybody who's familiar with the JKs, 07 to 17s, the sector shaft on the steering gearbox has been a bit of a problem. It's kind of anemic, kind of underpowered or undersized, especially when you start putting larger tires on. The gearboxes in general are kind of a weak link. They have a tendency to be overworked as far as being along the frame. You've got the sector shaft diameter is an issue. They've been known to shear off sector shafts. A few years back, I put a brace on mine that ties the steering gearbox not only into the left frame rail where it's bolted, but also tied across to kind of give it stability. Now that does nothing for the sector shaft per se, but it does help it does help hold that gearbox to the frame where they're bolted. So PSC, let me back up. If you go to a hydro assist steering, you're really putting most of the force down on the drag, or on the tie rod and the axle where your cylinder is. So you're kind of eliminating that failure point. That being said, hydro assist is a little overkill for the type of wheeling we do. We, on a scale of 1 to 5, we're generally, we've run the 2s, 2.5s for scenic, but we're generally in the 3.5 range most of the time when we're wheeling. I've done some 4s. I've done a couple that are borderline 4, 4.5, depending on who, the ratings are kind of subjective at times. I'm not a big fan of going out and thrashing and beating on my vehicles. I know there's guys that come back with body damage and it's, a badge of honor type thing, and to each their own, but that's just not me. I like going out and challenging myself a little bit as a driver, challenging my vehicle, but that being said, I've built this to handle way more aggressive, way more technical trails than I'll probably ever put it on. That's my safety margin, if you will. Wife and I like going out. Like I said, I like challenging myself in the vehicle, but we like going out and having a nice day on the trail, bring lunch, whatever, and not beating and thrashing on my vehicle. I don't want to come back with body damage. This is my daily driver. It hooks up behind my motorhome when we travel. It doesn't matter whether we're going somewhere and upscale and we want to cruise around. We've taken it down the strip of Vegas when we've gone into Vegas before. We've taken it to Moab and southwestern Colorado and Texas wheeling quite regularly. So both ends of the spectrum. So that being the case, the hydro assist steering is way overkill for the type of wheeling I do. It's not uncommon that I'll lock up the rear axle, but I can probably count on one hand a year how many times I lock my front axle based on the obstacles and so forth. I generally try them without locking up the front, and if I slip at all or whatever, then I'll lock up the front. So like I said, I could probably count on one hand how many times I actually lock up my front axle. So for me, this hydro assist was way overkill, but PSC has released a box. They've had it out for a few years now, and they're on revision number 2. But PSC has released a gearbox that has pretty much the same internals that you're going to find on the 3/4 and 1 ton Dodge trucks. So the stock gearbox has a 70 millimeter piston inside and a 35 millimeter sector shaft. So the first generation went to an 80 millimeter piston and a 42 millimeter sector shaft. The new XD2, I believe they're called, the big bore, is an 80 millimeter with a 45 millimeter sector shaft. So you've got more. It utilizes the pressure better because it's got a larger piston, so more surface area, so you have more force to turn them. And then also the biggest benefit is that larger diameter sector shaft. So anyway, I'll have you follow along as I'm going to do it. The gearbox swap is pretty straightforward. It's just undoing your lines, dropping the pitman, or I don't know, probably leave the pitman on the box, pulling it out because it comes with a new pitman. a new pitman arm. So I'll get up in the air and we'll pull all that. That's pretty straightforward. A couple other things I'm doing. I'm more than likely going to have to remove my brace, my box brace that goes across the other side of the frame rail. I'm not quite sure if it will work or not, so I may have to remove that. But while I'm at it, also I want to put a cooler, and I'm just going to use I got a derail heatsink style cooler. I'm going to put on the return line of my power steering so that I can have a cooler on the power steering line. I've already got a really good beefy transmission cooler on it, but I am going to put a power steering cooler on it while we're here. So I'm going to go over here and bring over to the bench, show you the gearbox, the pitman arm, and then I'll probably suck the fluid out of the gear, or out of the reservoir. The reservoir is remote on these. And then we'll go ahead and start disconnecting lines and get the box broke down and removed, put the new box and everything in, and then go ahead and figure out how and where I'm going to mount that power steering cooler. So follow along. All right, so here's the PSC gearbox. You can see how beefy and massive that pitman arm is. So, and the sector shaft. There's the sector shaft. So we will go ahead and just the gearbox in general it's heavy. You can tell it's got a lot of internals. It's heavy. So I don't have the other one out yet, but when I do, I'll kind of get a shot or a picture of the two side by side, and you'll be able to see the big difference in those sector shafts. So let's go ahead and get this thing up in the air and tear into it. So I've got my drag link disconnected and just zip tied here to the tie rod from the pitman arm. I've got the cross brace disconnected at the gearbox over here. So let's just go in here. And disconnect the cross brace from the right frame rail. This is actually a JKS cross brace. So there's the cross brace out. Okay, so here's the other. There's the aluminum block off of the other end of the other part of the JKS cross brace. So there's the part that's left is the sleeve that threads on the pitman arm, but we might as well just go ahead and leave that on. I don't see any need to take that off at the moment. Get some wiring, a couple of zip ties to pop loose here. All right, so here's the gearbox. There's the top adjustment right here. So you've got two lines. See if I can do this with the camera. You got the front one up here my finger's at. That's actually the most rear one. That's the one closest to where the steering, right there's where your steering column connects. This line right here, which is the rearmost one in the vehicle, that is your return line. So if you're gonna put a cooler in, it's the rearmost line right here. It actually goes over and drops, you see it right there, it drops down and then runs underneath the radiator. That's the return line. It goes back over to the reservoir. That's the one you want to put the cooler in line with. So I'm going to break those two fittings loose and then try to pull that gearbox loose and pull that out, and then we'll once I get the gearbox done, then I'll actually focus on cooler. So there's no easier, clean way to do this, but I keep a box of various sizes of plugs, caps, kicking around and I've also got a bunch of hydraulic fittings. These are actually O-ring style, so they're a straight thread with an O-ring, but I pulled the lines up, put a couple caps on them, and I did spill some oil. I've got some absorbent pads down underneath catching them, but you're not going to catch everything, but try to catch as much as possible. See if you can kind of see. Got a cap on there and a cap on there, and I did spill just a little bit down the frame rail and a few drops underneath, so I'll have to clean all that up off the frame after. All right, so here's the old one next to the new one. You can see the mass, difference in mass on these two. So I tip this, turn this one around, and turn this one around. And there's the Pitman arms. So you can see look at how much more massive this one is than this one. So there's your piston over here. Look at how much bigger that is. There's your sector shaft housing and the sector shaft itself. So I haven't pulled the Pitman arm off of that one, but you can just see the massive size difference. All right. So I've alley-ooped that heavy bastard up in there. And I'm not gonna lie, that is one heavy son of a gun. That is not something you want to do by yourself if you don't have to. My son was gonna help me when he got home from work, but he's not home from work yet. And I'm an impatient person, at least so I'm told by my wife and my son. So after I got it up in there, I thought, God, I wonder how much this thing weighs. I was going to grab the scale and weigh it, but I'll be damned if I'm going to pull that thing back down just to weigh it. So trust me, it's heavy. So I got it up in there, and I got a couple bolts started, so I'm just getting ready to snug up the other bolts. I want to make sure all my wiring's tucked out of the way. I got a few drips still coming down off it, so I was wiping those up. Then I'll go ahead and put the Pitman arm and connect the steering and the input from the column. So I'm at that point, and then I will move on to my cooler, but I want to at least get the gearbox itself set up. Now, one thing I'm doing differently here is with the JKS cross steering, or I don't know, I guess they call it a steering box cross frame brace that braced across to the right frame rail. With that came a pretty good hefty bracket that's gusseted and ribbed on the back side that bolts around the track bar, upper track bar mount, and also goes around the back side of the frame and ties the frame bracket and everything in place because it beefs up the frame from the back side. I had to get in there with my pneumatic Sawzall and trim a little edge of the bracket off, and I did that prior to painting it and everything, but I think that'll work out well. Which leads me up to the box comes with two shorter bolts for going in the front two holes that are not through holes on the gearbox. You want to make sure you do not put the long bolts in there. You'll break that cast housing. So the back two bolts are through holes. You use the OEM bolts for those. The fronts are not. Now, in my situation, or if anybody's watching and they decide to use that bracket, keep that bracket on, that adds a good 3/8, 5/16 on it. So what I did is I actually just trimmed down my OEM bolts because the ones they supplied with the gearbox in that front with my added bracket on back here was barely grabbing a few threads. So I just went ahead and trimmed down my original bolts. I went in and measured how much was sticking out of the frame. Then I went ahead and measured the hole in the gearbox with a set of calipers and subtracted it, and then I added myself in another 3/16 of an inch so it won't bottom out. So that's the point I'm at right now. I just trimmed the OEM bolts down, cleaned up the threads. I'm going to put some anti-seize on these, put these in, get it secured to the frame, get the input shaft connected and secured, and then I'll go ahead and go up top side, connect the lines, and then I'll come down and put the Pitman arm and everything on, and then move on to my cooler. Return line actually goes, even though it's a little taller, it goes under the pressure line. So I've got it in first, and then I went ahead and installed the pressure line right behind it, or actually in front of it, behind it if you're facing it. So there's both of them snugged in by hand. Let's go ahead and tighten them down. Okay. Both of those lines tightened down. I'll pull my rags out of the way and then I'll spray it down with a little bit of brake wash and clean everything up good. Go ahead and install my input shaft, and that should pretty much wrap the box installation up from up here. All right, so I've got the input, that column put on and tightened up. I've got the pitman arm up in place here. I'm actually just going to, I put a little bit of anti-seize on the actual splines, but then I'll use some Loctite on the threads, because that's something you don't really want coming off. All right, so I'm just snugging this thing down, and then you want to get a torque wrench out, and this nut gets torqued to 185 foot-pounds. Yeah, I think I'm gonna get the torque wrench out from there. So once you get the pitman arm tightened on, you're gonna want to move on to the bolts holding the gearbox to the frame. These get torqued at 70 foot-pounds. Okay, so the gearbox installation is complete. Everything's tightened down. I've cycled the steering, good for clearance. While I've got the system empty, I'm going to go ahead. I thought I had a 15-inch, but this is a 12-inch Derail heat sink style cooler for the power steering. And right up here above the right frame rail, under the air box, is where your power steering return line goes right up under to the reservoir. So I'd be I've got the same side inlet outlet. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to fabricate 2 brackets and weld them. There's a 2-inch round cross member just in front of the gearbox. So I'm going to weld 2 tabs on that, mount this where it tucks right up under the radiator, which will give me plenty of clearance. I pulled a straight edge just a few minutes ago to make sure my drag link isn't going to hit. And I think I'll have clearance, not a ton, but I'll have about 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch clearance there at full stuff up against my bump stop. So I think I'm just going to take and make a couple of L brackets with the bolt hole in it, bolt pattern in this, and weld them to that tube. So this bolts up, and then one line I'll cut the right ahead of the steel line. There's a piece of rubber on that return line. There's a rubber hose between the reservoir and the steel line that comes along underneath the front of the radiator here. So I'll cut that rubber line and tap into that and go one into here, and then the other one from here up, tie into the one that goes up to the reservoir. So that'll be in my return line, and it'll be right underneath here where it'll be, number one, protected. It's not going to be hanging out in the airflow, but the nice thing about these heat sink style is they'll dissipate the heat. They don't need to have, I mean, it's better to have air flowing across them, but they don't need, like a tube and fin or a stacked plate style, they don't need to have that airflow directly through them. They'll dissipate just because it's aluminum and it's a heat sink. So, and it gives me, I think these give another almost a quart capacity. So that alone will help with the cooling, let alone the aluminum. So I think that's my plan of action. Is I'm going to make 2 brackets, get them drilled, and probably thread certs or tapped, one of the two. and then weld them up underneath there, and then come in with my 2 fittings, and then I should just have 2 fairly short pieces of line of hose, power steering line. I'm thinking the one I'm gonna have to loop and kind of come back down. That one might be 16, 18 inches. The other one probably less than a foot. So that'll put this close enough to that where it'll be minimize my my risk factor on leaks. So that's the plan. So I'm going to go over and make a couple brackets. All right, so here's how we're going to mount this. I took a piece of 120 wall tubing, cut 2-inch length, and then slit it in half. So this will go around that cross member and be clamped, and then coming off of here will be the bracket with the mount like so. Actually like so. So we'll have the clamping this to the tube with the bolts. So now I just need to, I think I'll probably just use some like 1-inch flat. Yeah, probably 1-inch flat by 3/16 or something. By, I think this is just a little over 2. Yeah, 2 1/4. And drill and tap those and then weld them to these, and that's ready to mount up underneath that tubing. So I've got a piece of, this looks like 3/16. That's actually 1/4. Got a piece of 1/4-inch plate here, possibly a little overkill, but it's just what I had kicking around. So I'm going to square this up and cut it for the oil cooler mount. Okay, 2 brackets cut. I've radiused the outside corner that's going to be away from the weld. And I'll go over now and mark, drill and tap these, and then get ready to weld them onto the saddles. All right, so I'm going to set that in place, kind of center that tab on there, and use a transfer punch. There we go. All right, so I've got it clamped in here in my vise. And I'm just going to go ahead and use the drill press rather than the mill. And 1/4-20 takes a number 7 drill bit. Okay. All 4 holes drilled. Now let's put a light chamfer on all of them. All right, so I'll put some probably a little overkill, but I use my soft jaws quite a bit so that I don't put bite marks in the edges of my parts. So, and then I also use the Castrol Molly D cutting oil or cutting fluid. So let's put a little bit of that on there. I like using these tap guides just because they do help keep your holes perpendicular. Going in straight, perpendicular with the surface, so they do help. I've got a standard one and a metric one that I've used for years, and they serve me well, so I resort to using them often. In the drill, I'll drill press sometimes, but usually in the mill I'll use a tap starter to hold it square. But when I'm using the vise or out remotely, I will use these little tap guides, and these are, can't even remember where I got these. The lube, the Molly lube definitely helps though, so I highly recommend that. Here's my brackets that I built for the oil cooler. Go ahead and mock this up here real quick. And then I'll break it back down and paint it. Kind of nice when a plan comes together here. So I took measurements, I got everything set up in there, so now I can mock this up into, actually I got it on 180 degrees, but it's for mock up. The fittings need to go out the other side. So anyway, that will go up and fit around that cross member, and then stainless steel clamps around it, and that will hold my oil cooler into place, and that's not going anywhere. So let's go over and test fit it. So here's the round cross member. There's the saddle clamps. Fit it right up into place, and so I'll set it right down below the actual radiator, and it mounts right before the bend on that cross member where it bends out to the frame. So hell yeah, 2 clamps, one here and one there. And that is not going anywhere. Still allows me full access to my sway bar disconnect here, and is out of reach from the, I held a straight edge, when I was holding this up in place, I held a straight edge across here to make sure that I'm full stuff with that right side tire, full stuffed up against my bump stop, that my drag link isn't going to come in contact. I'm still clearing it by about 3/4 of an inch, 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch. So that's going to work perfect. Then I just got to switch around so the inlet and outlet will actually be on the other side, and it's going to be a fairly short run right up to the return line. That's going to work. That's going to work really well. All right, so the paint turned out pretty good on my brackets there. So I'm just finish assembling them. Had to just kind of do a quick mock-up and make sure everything's orientated correctly on the cross member. So I'm going to go fit it one more time, make sure everything's correct before I install my 2 NPT 2/3/8 barb fittings in the end. All right, so everything's tightened on. I'm going to go ahead and I think I test fit it up into place, but I think what I'm actually going to do is put the hoses on, clamp them underneath, and then snake the hose up through the hole, the opening that I have available. And then once I get it up inside, then I can go ahead and cut it back to where I need to for the routing. And personally, I kind of prefer these Oetiker style clamps, so that's what I'm using. I think they'd look a little cleaner, and running these on fuel lines and tranny lines for return lines and fuel lines on bikes and everything for quite a few years, so. All right. Should need to crimp that one just a little bit more. Okay. All right, so there's my cooler with the lines installed. Now I'll go ahead and put this up into, actually I'll snake the hoses up through where I want them, then put this on and clamp it, and then I'll lower the Jeep and go up top side. Probably pull the air box. That might be the easiest way for me to get to where I'm wanting to be. Here's the installation complete from below. So I've got my brackets tightened down to that cross member. I've got my hoses snaked up and around, and that is solid and not going anywhere. So I can still access my sway bar, my manual sway bar disconnect easily, and everything's clearing. So although it's not the ideal place to mount, it's very feasible and it's definitely protected up in there. So that's a good thing. Again, I think a lot of people mount theirs right behind the grill, but where I have a pretty good sized transmission cooler there already, I could probably mount a tube and fin or a stacked plate style, but for power steering, I really like these heat sink style. So there'll be enough airflow coming. Actually, you know what, to be honest with you, I just thought about this. It's actually right in the airflow area of coming through between my bumper and my tow bar bracket. I've got about 1.75 inches. It's coming right through, so it actually is somewhat in the airstream. Now, granted, when you're crawling around, there's not a lot of airflow there, but which is where you need it the most. But these heat sinks will do pretty good without a fan blowing across them or even a lot of airflow across them. So I think that actually turned out really well, and a good mounting location. So hopefully maybe that'll give somebody else an idea on a mounting location, because these JKs are kind of limited once you put a transmission cooler in front of the AC condenser there. So now I'm going to go ahead and lower it down, and I'm going to go up top. Probably have to pull my air box to get to that return line and see how I'm going to make the connection there. All right, I apologize here if I'm shaking a little bit. I'm going to go handheld here and show you where I tied in to my return line. Here's my remote reservoir. Here's where my air filter or my air box goes. I've got it removed, and I just had this lower bracket out that the lower air box snaps down into those 3 grommets. So I just put that back in. So you can reference, there's my batteries, my TIPM, and then, so if you look right down here, here are the 2 lines, nice and smooth and gradual, coming up around that round cross member that's right there. And so one line comes up behind the radiator hose and comes over up behind this line right here is the suction line for the pump. So this is the feed from the reservoir to the pump. So you can see the one line right there comes up underneath. Here's the return line on the reservoir. So right behind here is where I made my connection to the return line. The other side of that loops, makes a nice smooth loop under this box and goes back down right there. So right where all my hoses kind of intersect, if you see that blue, that's actually a piece of 5/8 heater hose that I cut about 3 inches, 3 inches long, and then I slit it lengthwise, wrapped it around. Anytime I have hoses that cross a sharp edge, anywhere where abrasion, anything like that can come into play, I'll wrap that around, zip tie it, and that way it acts as a guard. I've done that for, 25 plus years now on all my vehicles and anything else I do. And it really prolongs, it helps if those hoses do chafe or rub against each other, you're going to rub against that cover, and it's going to wear hopefully long before you ever catch the hose. So anyway, that's where the lines come up. So my installation is pretty much done. I just need to put fluid in it and bleed it and then road test it. You can see down here where my clamps are that hold my cooler on. So everything's zip wire tied, nice and snug, held out of the way very nicely. So yeah, that line zips right around underneath this box. And you know what, I may end up drilling a small hole and zip tying that line to it just so it doesn't rattle around or move around under that box there. But other than that, this section's done and connected. I have the airbox back in, everything hooked up. While I was at it, I go ahead and clean my throttle body. But I've got everything put back together up here. I've put about 1.5 quarts of power steering fluid in it, maybe a little bit more. And I cycled my steering, I don't know, 15, 18 times probably. And I'm just about ready to fire it. Oh, and my steering wheel was off a little bit, so I went ahead and adjusted my drag link just to get it close. So I'll fine tune that once I do a road test. So I think we're about ready to give this thing a test. All right, so let's fire it up. Let's run it through some cycles on the steering wheel. Double check my power steering fluid. She's right on the money. All right, so I think I'm going to set it down and do a road test. So that concludes my PSC Big Bore XD steering gearbox and derail oil cooler, power steering oil cooler installation. I hope it was beneficial. Like I said, the gearbox is a pretty straightforward swap, nothing out of the ordinary there. You know, if it's just half a dozen bolts and it's heavy and awkward. I flushed the lines while I was at it. Added the derail. To be honest with you, putting the oil cooler and running the lines and a few things for that took longer than doing the gearbox. So I hope this was beneficial. It is. I just got back from a road test. I got to give it a thumbs up so far. Now, granted, I haven't had it off road, but took it up on the interstate, took it down the highway, took it on some back roads. Drivability is very nice. I put about, I don't know, 16, 18 miles on it. Drivability is very good. It steers real easy. Sitting there even, granted, I'm running, you know, I think I'm running about 32, 34 pounds air pressure, but one finger, I can tell it's a little easier than the other. Again, my other one wasn't bad. I was mainly doing this for the sector shaft gain on the sector shaft diameter and the strength there. But if I gain a little bit of ease on steering, you know, 80 millimeter piston in this one versus a 70 in the OEM one, that's going to help. So I think the club's going on a run tomorrow. It's not really a technical run, but it'll be off-road, so we'll see how it does. And then, like I said, a full season of Jeeping, so I'll definitely test it out this season. I appreciate you watching. Thank you for taking the time to watch. If you like it, give me a thumbs up and subscribe. We got more videos to come. We got a lot of little projects going on, Jeep and RV related, and some other items as well. So I appreciate you watching again. And I'd like to thank, I've got, I don't know, another 80 new subscribers here in the last week or two, about 2 weeks, I guess. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I hope I'm not disappointing you. Thank you for watching.